The air shimmered above the plains of Castile, not from the heat of battle, but from the merciless oppression of the Spanish sun. It was July 1809, and the ground around the small market town of Talavera de la Reina was baked hard as iron, covered in dry, brittle grass that crunched under the boots of marching men. In the distance, the dust clouds rose like pillars of smoke, signalling the approach of a leviathan for the 20,000 men of the British Army standing in their heavy wool coats. The heat was already an enemy as lethal as the French. They were far from home, outnumbered, and tethered to a Spanish ally they did not trust. This was the moment the Peninsular War would shift from a series of skirmishes into a crucible of slaughter. This was the eve of the deadliest hour they had yet faced. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look at the map of Europe in that summer of 1809. Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of the continent. From the Atlantic to the Russian border, his marshals governed with absolute authority. The French army was not merely a military force. It was a legend, a machine that had crushed the empires of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Against this tide stood only the isolated island of Great Britain and her small volunteer army. The British soldier of this era was not yet the mythical figure of later Victorian law. To the French, the redcoat was a curiosity, a sailor who had lost his way on land, led by aristocrats who bought their commissions. The French expected to sweep them into the sea. Leading this British force was Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. At 40 years old, Wellesley was a man of icy composure and sharp, calculating intellect. He was not a general who sought glory for glory's sake. He was a pragmatist who understood logistics, terrain, and the grim mathematics of war. He knew that his army was the only one Britain possessed. If he lost these 20,000 men here in the dust of Spain, the war would be over, and British resistance on the continent would be extinguished for a generation. But Wellesley was not fighting alone, and that was the source of his greatest frustration. Anchoring his right flank was the Spanish army of Extremadura, some 33,000 strong, commanded by General Gregorio de la Cuesta. The relationship between the two commanders was poisonous. Cuesta was elderly, infirm, and stubbornly traditional. Just days prior, on July 23rd, Wellesley had presented Cuesta with a golden opportunity to strike the French corps of Marshal Victor while it was isolated. Cuesta had refused, citing religious scruples about fighting on a Sunday. By the time he agreed to move, the window had closed, and the French had been reinforced by the army of the centre under King Joseph Bonaparte and General Jourdan. The opportunity for an easy victory was gone. Now the hunters became the hunted. The combined French force, numbering 46,000 seasoned veterans, turned to crush the Allies. Realising the danger, Wellesley pulled his troops back to the defensive position he had scouted earlier, the town of Talavera and the ridgelines to its north. The disposition of the Allied army on the morning of July 27th was a study in contrasts. Cuesta's Spaniards took the town itself. It was a strong position, a maze of walls, olive groves and drainage ditches that made it nearly impossible for cavalry to attack. They were safe, largely protected from the coming storm. Wellesley, however, took the open ground to the left. His line stretched from the olive groves north toward a commanding height known as the Cerro de Medellin. The Cerro de Medellin was the key to the entire battlefield. It was a steep, rugged hill that dominated the valley. Whoever held the Cerro controlled the fight. Wellesley knew it, and the French Marshal Victor knew it. As the afternoon of the 27th wore on, the British soldiers took their positions. They were tired, hungry, and thirsty. The commissariat system had failed, and rations were scarce. But as they looked across the Portina stream, a shallow, muddy tributary that separated them from the enemy, they saw the glint of thousands of bayonets emerging from the dust. The French army of the centre arrived not as a mob, but with the terrifying precision of conquerors. Drummers beat the pas de charge, and the columns of infantry manoeuvred with a fluidity that awed even the British officers watching through their telescopes. King Joseph was desperate for a victory to legitimize his shaky rule over Spain. Marshal Victor, aggressive and reckless, saw the British deployment and smelled blood. He did not want to wait for the next day. He did not want to wait for proper reconnaissance. As the sun began to set, casting long blood-red shadows across the dry grass, Victor ordered his men to prepare for a night attack. He intended to seize the Cerro de Medellin under the cover of darkness and sweep the British from the field before the sun rose again. Before the sun had fully vanished behind the horizon, the friction of war sparked into life at the Casa de Salinas, a ruined house positioned forward of the British lines. Here, amidst the tangled undergrowth of the woods, the British pickets were suddenly overrun by French light infantry, the voltigeurs. These were the skirmishers of the French army, masters of irregular warfare, moving swiftly through the trees to probe the enemy's strength. The surprise was absolute. In the confusion, Sir Arthur Wellesley himself, observing from a vantage point near the casa, was nearly captured. He mounted his horse just as the French swarmed the position, escaping by the narrowest of margins. It was a stark reminder of how fluid and dangerous the situation had become. The British line stabilized, but the psychological blow had been struck. The French were close, they were aggressive, and they were not waiting for the formalities of daylight. As night finally fell over the valley of the Tagus, a heavy, suffocating darkness blanketed the battlefield. In the 19th century, night attacks were rare. Command and control were difficult enough in broad daylight with flags and bugles, but in the pitch black, they were a recipe for chaos. Yet Marshal Victor was undeterred. He ordered General Ruffin's division to seize the Cerro de Medellin immediately. He believed the British hold on the hill was tenuous, perhaps thinking they had not yet fully deployed. Under the cover of a moonless sky, the French columns began their ascent. The Cerro was steep and rugged, covered in loose stones and scrub that masked the sound of their approach until the very last moment. Defending this sector were the men of the King's German Legion and a brigade under Colonel Donkin. These troops, tired and on edge, strained their eyes against the gloom. Suddenly, the darkness erupted. Muzzle flashes illuminated the ridgeline like strobe lights, revealing the blue coats of the French infantry surging over the crest. The roar of musketry shattered the silence of the valley. Panic, the soldiers' most constant companion, rippled through the British ranks. In the confusion, commands were lost in the din. The French, utilizing their momentum, managed to seize the summit of the hill. For a brief, terrifying moment, the key to the entire battle, and perhaps the fate of the British army in Spain, was in French hands. If they could hold the heights, they could enfilade the entire British line at dawn with artillery. Forcing a disastrous retreat, General Rowland Hill, commander of the 2nd Division, rode forward to investigate the commotion. In the darkness, he saw figures moving on the crest and assumed they were British stragglers, or perhaps the German Legion repositioning. He rode right up to them, only to be grabbed by a French soldier who demanded his surrender. Hill, reacting with instinct, spurred his horse, which was shot out from under him, but he managed to break free. The realization was electric. The enemy was on the hill. Wasting no time, Hill rallied the nearest regiment, the 29th Foot. There was no time for elaborate formations or firing drills. This was a brawl. He ordered them to charge with the bayonet. The men of the 29th, screaming their regiment's name, surged up the dark slope. They crashed into the French on the summit. A chaotic melee of stabbing steel and clubbed muskets fought in near-total blindness. The French, disoriented by the ferocity of the counterattack and unsure of the numbers facing them, wavered and then broke. They were driven back down into the valley, leaving the summit once again in British hands. The firing died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the survivors. The hill had been saved, but the cost was high. Over 800 men from both sides lay dead or wounded in the scrub, casualties of a battle that hadn't technically begun. The armies settled into an uneasy rest, sleeping on their arms. British soldiers, lying on the rocky ground of the Cerro, could hear the French talking and moving just below them in the darkness. The proximity was unnerving. They knew that when the sun rose, the slaughter would resume. The dawn of July 28th broke with a deceptive beauty, the sky turning a pale violet before the harsh Spanish sun asserted itself once more. At 5 a.m., the silence was ripped apart. The French had used the night to position their artillery. Massive batteries of cannons opened fire from the opposing ridge, sending iron balls smashing into the British positions on the Cerro de Medellin. The bombardment was intense. On the hard, stony ground, cannonballs didn't just bury themselves in the earth. They ricocheted, skipping unpredictably through the ranks, smashing limbs and shattering bodies. Under this iron rain, the French drums began to beat again. Marshal Victor, having failed in the night, was determined to succeed in the day. He ordered Ruffin's division, battered but reorganized, to assault the hill once more. This time, however, there would be no surprise. The British could see them coming. The French tactic was standard, but terrifying. Massive columns of infantry, designed to punch a hole through the enemy line by sheer weight of numbers. As they marched up the slope, their shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" drifted up to the waiting redcoats. On the summit, Wellesley had deployed his men in a way that would become his trademark. He ordered them to lie down on the reverse slope, just behind the crest of the hill. This simple command saved thousands of lives, shielding the infantry from the worst of the French artillery fire. To the advancing French, the hill appeared almost empty, defended only by a thin screen of skirmishers and a few artillery pieces. They marched upward, anticipating victory, unaware that just over the skyline, thousands of muskets were being primed, levelled, and waited only for the command to fire. As the French columns neared the crest of the Cerro de Medellin, the suspense among the British ranks was agonizing. Lying flat in the dry grass on the reverse slope, the men of the 29th, the 48th, and the King's German Legion could see nothing of the enemy but the tops of their shako hats bobbing against the sky. They could hear the tramp of thousands of boots, the rattle of equipment, and the guttural commands of French officers urging their men forward. To the French, the hilltop appeared abandoned, a prize ready for the taking. They accelerated, sensing weakness, their formations dense and deep, a human battering ram designed to smash through resistance by sheer weight. Then, at a signal from Wellesley, the trap was sprung. A singular, sharp command cut through the morning air. "Stand up!" In an instant, the barren ridge bristled with red and blue. 2,000 British soldiers rose from the earth as if conjured by magic, their muskets already levelled. The French vanguard, mere yards away, stopped dead in their tracks, stunned by the sudden apparition. Before they could level their own weapons or deploy from their marching columns into a firing line, the order to fire was given. The result was a physics lesson written in blood. The French were in a column formation, a deep rectangle of men. Only the first two rows could fire their muskets effectively. The men behind were blocked by their own comrades. The British, however, were in a line, 2 men deep and stretching wide across the hillside. Every single British musket could bear on the target. The volley that erupted was not a ragged rattle, but a single deafening crash that sounded, as veterans would later describe it, like the tearing of a giant canvas sheet. A wall of lead slammed into the head of the French column. The front ranks were simply erased, shattered by the concentrated impact of 1,000 musket balls. The momentum of the French attack evaporated instantly. The survivors wavered, blinded by the sudden cloud of sulphurous white smoke that engulfed the ridge. Before they could recover, the British cheered, a sharp, unison "Huzzah!" and charged forward, with bayonets lowered. The psychological shock was too great. The vaunted French infantry, conquerors of Europe, broke and fled back down the slope they had just climbed, leaving the hillside carpeted with their dead. As the French retreated, the British artillery added a new horror to the mix. For the first time in a major engagement, the British deployed a secret weapon, spherical case shot, invented by Henry Shrapnel. These were hollow cannonballs filled with musket balls and a timing fuse. They burst in the air, directly over the heads of the retreating French columns, raining deadly lead from above. It was a technological terror that the French had no answer for, turning an orderly retreat into a desperate scramble for cover. By mid-morning, the fighting on the Chero died down. The French assault had failed twice, once by night and once by day. A strange paralysis now gripped the battlefield, dictated not by generals, but by the sun. It was nearly noon, and the heat in the valley had become unbearable. Temperatures soared well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was still and suffocating, thick with dust and the lingering stench of black powder. Soldiers on both sides, encased in thick wool uniforms and carrying 60 pounds of gear, began to collapse from heat stroke. By mutual unspoken consent, the war simply stopped. A profound silence descended over Talavera. The cannons ceased their thunder. The muskets fell silent. What followed was one of the most surreal scenes of the Peninsular War. The Portina stream, a muddy trickle of water flowing between the two armies, beckoned to the parched men. Slowly, tentatively, soldiers from both sides left their lines. They walked down to the banks of the stream, muskets left behind, driven by a thirst that overrode all animosity. For an hour, British and French soldiers mingled on the banks of the Portina. They drank from the same muddy water, washing the grime and blood from their faces. They swapped canteens. Some traded tobacco and brandy. Officers from opposing armies tipped their hats to one another, conversing in broken French and English about the heat and the madness of the morning. For a brief window in time, they were not enemies, but fellow sufferers in a harsh land. It was a glimpse of humanity amidst the carnage, a recognition of the shared profession of arms, but the truce was fragile. On the French side of the valley, a heated council of war was taking place. King Joseph was hesitant, shaken by the heavy casualties of the morning. He considered breaking off the engagement, but Marshal Victor was furious. His pride was wounded. He argued passionately that the British were on the breaking point, that one more massive, coordinated push against the centre and the heights would shatter Wellesley's line. He cajoled the king, insisting that to retreat now, before the emperor's brother had won a victory, would be a disgrace. Reluctantly, King Joseph agreed. At around 1:00 p.m., the drums began to roll again on the French side. The sound drifted down to the stream. The soldiers at the water's edge looked up, the spell broken. They hurriedly shook hands, gathered their equipment, and returned to their respective lines to prepare to kill each other once more. The lull was over. The French were massing for the killing blow, a general assault across the entire front. The deadliest hour was about to begin. The tranquility of the midday truce vanished as 80 French cannon roared into life simultaneously. The valley shook with a violence that surpassed the morning's bombardment. This was the prelude to the grand assault, Marshal Victor's master plan to crush the British army once and for all. He would not just attack the hill this time, he would launch a coordinated hammer blow against the entire British line. To the south, near the town of Talavera, General Sebastiani's corps, 14,000 men, began their advance against the British centre. Their target was the position held by the Guards Brigade and the Germans. These were the elite of the British army, tall men in pristine uniforms, but they were about to be tested to their limits. The French columns came on like a dark tide, drums beating a relentless rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the pounding hearts of the defenders. As Sebastiani's men closed the distance, the British artillery tore gaps in their ranks, but the French, disciplined, closed up the holes and kept marching. They were veterans, accustomed to walking through cannon fire. When they reached musket range, the British line erupted. The rolling volleys began again, a ceaseless rhythmic hammering of lead that chewed through the front of the French columns. The French wavered, halted, and tried to deploy into line to return fire, but the British volume of fire was overwhelming. Seeing the French hesitate, the British Guards Brigade, commanded by Henry Campbell, sensed victory. Their blood was up. With a roar, they fixed bayonets and charged. The French centre buckled and then broke, fleeing back towards their own lines. The Guards, flushed with the exhilaration of success, gave chase. They pursued the retreating French deep into the valley, abandoning their defensive positions and running headlong into the killing ground. It was a fatal mistake. In their excitement, the Guards had advanced too far. They had broken the cohesion of the British line, leaving their flanks completely exposed. Waiting for them were the French reserves and artillery. As the Guards ran forward, disordered and breathless, French batteries opened up on them with canister shot, tins filled with musket balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. Simultaneously, French cavalry and fresh infantry regiments slammed into their exposed flanks. The hunters instantly became the prey. The Guards were decimated. In minutes, hundreds of Britain's finest soldiers were cut down. The survivors, panicked and broken, turned and fled back towards their own lines, crashing through the ranks of the King's German Legion and the battalion of detachments stationed behind them. The entire British centre was dissolving into chaos. Through the smoke, Sir Arthur Wellesley watched the disaster unfold from his observation post on the Cerro. His face remained an impassive mask, but his mind was racing. He saw the gap yawning open in the centre of his line. He saw the victorious French regrouping to pour through that breach. If they succeeded, they would split his army in two and roll up his flanks. The battle was lost. The army was lost. The war was lost. But Wellesley had already anticipated this. He had held one unit in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. He turned to an aide and gave a calm, precise order. Bring up the 48th. The 48th Regiment of Foot, the Northamptonshires, were stationed on the reverse slope of the Cerro. They had been watching the battle, waiting for their moment. Now, it had arrived. Led by Colonel Donnellan, a man who, legend says, was dressed in the fashion of the previous century with powdered hair and knee breeches, the 48th marched down from the heights. They moved not with the frantic energy of the fleeing Guards, but with a terrifying mechanical precision. They were marching directly into the storm. As they reached the chaotic centre, the retreating Guards ran past them, some shouting that all was lost. The 48th ignored them. They wheeled to the right, forming a perfect line across the gap, a dam of red coats against the flood of blue. The French, seeing the British centre seemingly empty, were rushing forward, convinced the battle was won. They were met by the 48th. The regiment halted. The men levelled their muskets. They waited until the French were point blank. Then, they delivered a volley so devastating, so perfectly timed, that it stopped the French advance dead in its tracks. They reloaded with practiced speed and fired again, and again. The 48th stood alone, a thin red line in a sea of confusion, holding back the entire weight of Sebastiani's corps. Their steadiness allowed the broken Guards and Germans to rally behind them. The line reformed. The gap was plugged. The French, stunned by this sudden, immovable wall of resistance where they expected a rout, lost their momentum. The crisis had passed, saved by the discipline of a single regiment and the foresight of a commander who knew exactly when to play his final card. But while the centre held, a new drama was unfolding on the left flank. The French cavalry was massing. On the left flank, the threat of the French cavalry hung like a guillotine blade over the British army. The horsemen, dragoons and hussars in their ornate jackets, wheeled and postured, looking for any sign of weakness, a loose formation, a wavering line, a gap they could exploit to ride down the infantry. But as the dust settled from the centre, they saw something that gave them pause. The British line had not broken, thanks to the iron discipline of the 48th Foot and the rallying of the Guards. The Red Wall was intact once more. The bayonets were fixed, the muskets loaded, and the men stood ready. Against such a solid formation, a cavalry charge was suicide. The French horsemen pulled back, their opportunity lost in the face of the infantry's stubborn refusal to yield. The infantry battle had reached a bloody stalemate. Marshal Victor's grand assaults had been shattered. His columns, designed to smash through the enemy, had been dismantled by the linear firepower of Wellesley's troops. The French infantry, demoralized and exhausted, fell back to their starting positions. They had climbed the hill of death twice, and twice they had been thrown back. They would not go a third time. But while the muskets fell silent, the artillery did not. The French batteries, frustrated by the resilience of the British infantry, poured a vengeful fire into the Allied lines. The British artillery responded in kind. For the next few hours, the battle transformed into a duel of iron. Cannonballs ploughed through the ranks, and the air filled with the shrieking hiss of shrapnel shells bursting overhead. The British infantry could do nothing but stand and endure, closing the gaps in their files whenever a man went down, maintaining the line that was their only protection. It was in this late afternoon phase, under the relentless pounding of the guns, that the battlefield itself turned against the soldiers. The summer of 1809 had been exceptionally dry. The tall grass that covered the valley, already trampled and matted, was as brittle as tinder. The wadding from thousands of muskets and the smouldering fuses of shells had sparked small fires throughout the day. Now, fanned by the hot wind and fed by the intensity of the artillery exchange, these isolated spots of flame began to merge. At first, it was just a haze of blue-grey smoke that differed from the white sulphur of the gunpowder. Then, soldiers noticed the heat rising from the ground, distinct from the oppression of the sun. Lines of orange flame began to snake across the no-man's land between the two armies. The grass, knee-high and parched, ignited with terrifying speed. What started as a nuisance quickly grew into a catastrophe. The wind whipped the flames into a frenzy, creating a wall of fire that moved unpredictably across the front, sweeping through the areas where the fighting had been fiercest. This was the Devil's Garden. The fire did not distinguish between uniform or rank. It swept toward the places where the wounded lay thickest, the slopes of the Cerro de Medellin and the open ground where the Guards had been mauled. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden light over the smoke-choked valley, a horror unfolded that eclipsed the violence of the battle itself. The grass fires, now raging out of control, swept over the wounded men who lay helpless between the lines. For the soldiers standing in the ranks, still gripping their muskets, the scene was a nightmare made real. They could hear the screams of their comrades, men they had messed with, marched with and fought alongside, crying out for help as the flames overtook them. But military discipline held them in place. To break the line was to invite a French attack. To move was to desert. They were forced to watch, helpless, as the fire consumed the fallen. The flames moved with a crackling roar, devouring the dry vegetation and anything trapped within it. Hundreds of wounded men, unable to crawl to safety due to shattered legs or exhaustion, faced a grim fate. The fire detonated the cartridge boxes still strapped to the waists of the dead and dying, causing small explosions that scattered embers further and added a erratic popping percussion to the roar of the blaze. The smell of burning grass mixed with the sickening scent of roasting flesh, a stench that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their days. In some sectors, the horror broke the rigid animosity of the war. British and French soldiers, seeing the fire threatening their own wounded, rushed forward into the burning no-man's land. For the second time that day, the enemies worked together, this time in a desperate race against the flames. They dragged maimed men by their coats, pulling them to the safety of the bare earth or the muddy banks of the Portina stream. But for many, the rescue came too late. The fire claimed hundreds of victims who had survived the shot and shell only to perish in the inferno. As twilight finally settled over Talavera, the fires burned themselves out, leaving behind a blackened, smoking wasteland. The fighting slowly sputtered to a halt. There was no formal ceasefire, no trumpet call ending the day. The exhaustion simply became too great for either army to continue. The French army of the centre, battered and rebuffed, held their positions on the far ridge. The British, victorious but shattered, slept where they stood on the heights of the Cerro. The night of July 28th was a sombre echo of the previous evening, but infinitely heavier. The silence was punctuated by the cries of the surviving wounded and the crackle of smouldering stumps. The army that lay down on the hard Spanish earth was not the same one that had woken up that morning. They had survived the deadliest hour, but the cost had been exorbitant. Over 14,000 men from both sides lay dead or wounded on the field. The British army had held its ground, but it had been bled white. The morning of July 29th revealed the full scale of the carnage. The rising sun illuminated a landscape that looked less like a battlefield and more like the interior of a charnel house. The slopes of the Cerro de Medellin, the prize for which so many had died, were carpeted with the bodies of French grenadiers and British infantrymen, often lying side by side. The blackened swathes of burnt grass were stark scars against the yellow earth, marking the graves of those claimed by the fire. British sentries, peering through the morning mist, expected to see the French columns forming up for a third day of assaults. Instead, they saw movement of a different kind. The French army was retreating, Marshal Victor and King Joseph, having realized that Wellesley's position was unbreakable and his troops immovable, had decided to withdraw. The columns of the army of the centre were marching away towards Madrid, leaving the field in the possession of the Allies. A ripple of relief, rather than triumph, passed through the British lines. They had won. The Redcoats, derided by the French as mere amateurs, had stood toe-to-toe with the conquerors of Europe and beaten them back. They had proven that the British line was superior to the French column. They had proven that Wellesley's eye for terrain and his reverse slope tactic could neutralise the French artillery. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The casualty returns were grim reading for Sir Arthur Wellesley. The British had lost over 5,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. That was a quarter of his entire force. The 48th Foot, the saviours of the centre, had lost heavily. The Guards Brigade was a shadow of its former self. The Spanish allies, though they had held the town, had not been heavily engaged, and the friction between Wellesley and Cuesta remained unresolved. The logistics of the aftermath were a nightmare. The British army had no transport wagons, as the Spanish promises of supply had not materialized. Thousands of wounded men had to be treated in makeshift field hospitals in Talavera, where surgeons worked with rolled-up sleeves and bloody sores, amputating limbs without anesthetic amidst the heat and flies. When Wellesley eventually had to withdraw his army back to Portugal to refit, he was forced to make the heart-wrenching decision to leave many of the worst wounded behind to the mercy of the French. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a reminder that in the Peninsular War, survival was often just a prelude to further hardship. Yet, despite the horror and the logistical failures, something fundamental had changed on the morning of July 29th. The aura of French invincibility had been pierced. The British soldier now knew, with absolute certainty, that he could beat the Frenchman. He knew that if he stood his ground, held his fire, and trusted his commander, victory was possible. The Battle of Talavera was not the strategic stroke that ended the war. The conflict in Spain and Portugal would rage on for another 5 grueling years. The British army would retreat, advance, retreat again, and fight many more bloody battles before they finally crossed the Pyrenees into France. But Talavera was the moral turning point. It was the anvil upon which the weapon that would eventually destroy Napoleon was forged. For his victory, Sir Arthur Wellesley was elevated to the peerage. he became Viscount Wellington of Talavera. The name would become synonymous with British military excellence, but more importantly, the battle vindicated his system. The combination of the reverse slope defence, the two-deep line, and the disciplined controlled volley became the standard doctrine of the British Army. It was a tactical formula that would be repeated at Salamanca, at Vittoria, and ultimately on the muddy fields of Waterloo. The men who survived the deadliest hour of Talavera carried a unique pride. They were the veterans who had stood firm when the centre broke. They were the men who had charged the hill in the dark. They were the soldiers who had faced the fire and the fury of the French Empire and refused to blink. In the history of the British Empire, there are battles with higher strategic stakes and battles with greater fame. But Talavera remains the soldier's battle. It was a contest of sheer endurance, a test of nerve where the outcome hung by a thread, saved by the coolness of a commander and the stubborn courage of the common infantryman. As the years passed and the grass grew back over the scorched earth of the Tagus Valley, the scars of the land healed. But the legacy of that hot July day remained. It was the day the British Army came of age. It was the day they looked into the abyss of defeat, saw the fire approaching, and simply held the line. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.